a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well to take heed as unto the light that shineth in a dark place until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. What on earth did he mean? He was an eyewitness, and yet he says we have even something better. We have the more sure word of prophecy. What on earth is he talking about? Lord Kelvin, William Thompson, known as Lord Kelvin, made an interesting remark. He says, until we can measure a thing, we really know very little about it. That's what drives many scientists to really measure things, to really make sure we understand them. Well, can we measure confidence? I want to anchor our following discussion on simply one manuscript fact. The Hebrew scriptures that we call the Old Testament were translated into Greek by 270 BC. That's called the Septuagint version. We have many copies available in any bookstore. These Hebrew scriptures contain over 300 prophecies that detail their coming Messiah. 300 of them. And let's take a look at a few of these. That he was to be of the David's family. He would be born of a virgin. He'd be born in Bethlehem. They would sojourn in Egypt. He would live in Galilee. Each one of these are from the Old Testament in Nazareth. He'd be announced by an Elijah-like herald. This would occasion the massacre of Bethlehem's children. It would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include the Gentiles. His ministry would be one of healing. He would teach through parables. He'd be disbelieved and rejected by the rulers. And it goes on. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding a donkey. He would be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. He would be like a smitten shepherd, be given vinegar and gall. They would cast lots for his garments. His side would be pierced. Not a bone would be broken. He would die among malefactors. His dying words were foretold. He'd be buried by a rich man. He would rise from the dead on the third day. And his resurrection would be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. This is just a sampling of a list of 300. What I'd like to do in the brief time we have remaining is to examine just 8 of these and come to some conclusions about them. Just 8, and we're going to take the simplest ones. Let's take the first one. You've all read it on Christmas cards, if nothing else. Micah 5:2, but thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. We could spend a whole hour just extracting the gems that are tucked away in this one verse, but we're going to... Because of that experience, when we encounter the concept of eternity, we jump to the conclusion that it's sort of like a line that starts at infinity on the one end and goes to infinity on the right. That eternity is equivalent to having lots of time. Now that happens to make good poetry, but it happens to be bad physics. Because time implies mass. Time varies with mass, acceleration, gravity. And we're in disconnect here. The nature of God. Is God subject to restrictions of mass? I don't think so. Is God subject to acceleration? I don't think so. Is he subject to gravity? I don't think so. See, God is not simply somebody with lots of time. He's somebody outside the dimension of time altogether. And boy, that makes a difference. Does that make a difference? And it's the uniqueness of his personal imprint that he uses to authenticate his messages. If God has the technology to create us in the first place, he has the technology to get a message to us. The trick is, how does he authenticate it? How does he let us know that the message is really from him and not some kind of contrivance or a fraud? Isaiah makes this remark in 57:15. He says, for thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity. And so he certainly has the technology to create us in the first place, but how does he authenticate his message so that we know that it is really from him and not a contrivance or fraud? By declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, the things that are not yet done, is just one of many passages we could quote in that direction. Do you remember Mr. and Mrs. Flat? Do you remember that as a three-dimensional person, I could approach this two-dimensional universe, and I had a proximity to either of them that's independent of their distance, and I would suggest also independent of time. My time is not the same as their time. Let's talk about the geometry of eternity for a minute. If I take this imaginary line that represents time and imagine my pulling it out towards you from the blackboard here, so to speak, and visualize this line now coming out at you from the screen, and let's put ourselves at a point in that that we call the present. Behind us is the past. Ahead of us is the future. We're in the now right now. What's past is a memory. What's in the future is a hope. Now, for someone who is outside the dimensionality of that timeline, say in eternity, inhabiting eternity, that person can see the past, the present, the future simultaneously. Let me give you an analogy. Let's assume that we were in Southern California watching the Rose Parade. We're sitting on the curb, and for several hours we watch coming from the front, around the corner comes the marching bands and the next float, and then the various whatever. For us, sitting on that curb, the parade is a sequence of events, coming around that corner, going around, turning down the next street. For us, in the plane of that parade's existence, it's a sequential series of events. To someone who's not in the plane of its existence, say in a helicopter above the parade, they can look down and see the staging area where the floats are being organized. They can see the parade route, and they can also see where they're being disbanded. For someone who is not in the plane of its existence, they can simultaneously see the beginning and the end together, so to speak. A poor example in some respects, but it's maybe illustrative of what I'm suggesting here. So God is outside the dimensionality of time. So eternity is more than having lots of time. It's being outside the boundaries of our reality. Albert Einstein, my favorite quote of his, says, "People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." I love that. How vivid, how graphic. Our entire life has been committed to two strategic discoveries. You have in your laps, I hope, a collection of 66 books that we glibly call the Bible. 66 separate books that were compiled over 2,000 years, longer than the lifetime of any of the writers, obviously, and most of these writers didn't know each other. In fact, there's about 40 of them. Over 40 authors that penned 66 different books over several thousand years. The first discovery that you need to make for yourself is the discovery that it is an integrated message. I don't mean that it's simply a theme of the old fulfilled in the new. No, no, much more than that. I'm going to suggest that every detail we now discover is deliberately designed in anticipation of what follows. Now, if that's true, and you need to discover that for yourself, and I'll give you some examples here shortly, then that's the first discovery. We have an integrated message system, 66 separate books, 40 different guys, over thousands of years, in which every detail is anticipated by deliberate, skillful design. That leads to the second discovery that's even more startling, that you can demonstrate, you can prove that that origin of that message had to come from outside the time domain, simply because it anticipates with an astonishing precision history before it happens. And that is its authentication. Now, we have the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, and the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. It is a single integrated design. Every number, every place name is there deliberately. And Jesus gave a hint of that. Jesus said, "Think not that I come to destroy the Torah, the law, or the prophets. I come not to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law till all be fulfilled." Now, a jot or a tittle is a Hebraism. A jot is one of the 22 Hebrew letters that you and I would mistake for an apostrophe. And the tittle is a little decorative hook on some of the letters. And so it's like saying, not the crossing of a T or the dotting of an I will pass until all the law is fulfilled. It's a call to taking it very seriously. There are, by at least one cataloging, there are over 8,000 predictive verses on almost 2,000 different predictions on 700 different matters. That's J. Barton Payne's encyclopedia. That's his particular cataloging of them. Now, if that's true, can we measure how confident we are? If we think, gee, some of us believe the Bible, sure, but how confident can we be? How sure can we be? Peter wrote in one of his letters, second letter, said, "We have not followed cunningly devised fables when we made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty." He's, of course, alluding to Matthew 17, the transfiguration. But a few verses later, he goes on to say, even though he's speaking as an eyewitness, he says something startling. He says, "We have also